Hi, everyone. Welcome to episode 6 of the Africa India Global Dialogue series. I'm Veda Vaidyanathan from the Foreign Policy team at CSEP. This is a monthly webinar series that CSEP co curates with the African Union Development Agency. And the theme for this episode is titled Africa's Energy Leap Driving Abundance While Tackling Climate Change. We have with us Grace Chileshi from the energy and power sector data expert from the Continental Energy Program in Africa. We have Rahul Tongia, senior fellow at CSEP. We have Divyam Nagpal from Sustainable Energy for All. And hopefully we'll be quickly joined by Prudence Lihabi, who's founder of Youth for Sustainable Energy. So with this excellent panel, we are hoping to unpack a lot of these issues. But to get us started, we have Kosi Taulasi from the African Union Development Agency. Kosi, if you could get us started with some opening remarks and paint the canvas for us. Why is this theme important for us to discuss today?
Thank you, Veda, and thank you, everybody. And good morning or good afternoon, depending on where you are. I'm Kosi Tulasi, Head of Industrialization, Trade, Market, Economic Analysis at Agency-NEPAD. And energy is fundamental to the development, and it serves as a backbone for infrastructure as well as industries. As we observe the growth in African economies and the ambition of India, it became very clear that access to affordable and reliable energy is essential for our progress. In this webinar, we're looking to discuss a number of key and very strategic points. Among those points, we're looking into the untapped potential in Africa and looking at the vast resources in solar, radiation, wind corridors, and also geothermal reserves, critical for the advancements of the African Union Agenda 2063. We also, and it's my hope that we'll be looking at the need for regional and international cooperation, the climate crisis that we all face, the diversifying partnership in various areas, particularly looking at the global south, India, and the role that is playing, and also looking at the perspective from India in terms of energy transition, what has been achieved over the past years, the milestone, and some of them surpassing their target of electrification, and looking at the targets for renewable energy, which represent about 42% of the total installed power capacity. We look into African leadership in energy transition and what does it mean for African country. Looking into the case of Kenya that generate over 90% from renewable energy. Morocco with a target of 52% by 2030. And what that mean for each African countries in terms of low carbon or carbon decarbonization economies in Africa. And also looking into the importance of sustainable system, what is essential for meeting current and future population needs, and a focus on inclusive energy, which is very important, not leaving anyone behind. The responsible mineral mining, the labor-friendly industries, and looking from the perspective of the African Green Mineral Strategy. These are key, and I hope we'll discuss those elements. In conclusion, I think I'm very eager to anticipate the expert panel, what they will say about the above topics, and also looking through the South-South solidarity, the knowledge sharing and innovation, and what we can create, how we can create a future where energy transition drive equitable, sustainable development. These are my thoughts, and I hope this will serve as basis of the discussion, and I thank you.
Thank you, Kosi. Thank you, Kosi. So we have like 10 big themes and we have less than an hour. So let's get started. And what I'm hoping to do is not to really go question and answer. I really hope to sort of have a dialogue with all of our panelists. But to get started, and Rahul, I'm going to look at you at the beginning because you helped frame the title for this seminar. From Kosi's opening remarks, I get the sense that on the one hand, a lot of these African governments need to balance their developmental needs and on the other hand, their climate responsibilities. So what does energy leap in this context, in a regional or a national context, really mean? And how can a South-South solidarity, or how can Indian actors really work with our partners in Africa? Why don't you get us started, Rahul? Rahul, your mic. Sorry.
Thank you, Veda, and thank you, Kosi, for setting this up, but also highlighting this one word that really is explains the challenges, which is balancing act, or what people call trade-offs. So when we think about Africa, I think there's very little dispute that it's a huge demand, both existing and latent, and it'll only grow as the economic growth progresses across the continent. But there's now this tension between what type of growth, what fuels we use, especially in the power sector, for example, which dominates a lot of the energy needs. There's very little heating requirement. It's cooling that will come up eventually, but also there are other needs for energy. And then for Africa, there's a particular challenge, which is a little different from what the rest of the world still faces, what India faced a little while ago, which is access. So household electrification is still not 100% in large swaths of Africa. It's in fact missing by tens of percent in several countries. And obviously some countries do better. I'm sure my colleagues here will talk about the heterogeneity. You talked about Kenya as a positive outlier. Of course, not every country has geothermal energy available to it. So local resources are another ingredient that will drive the story going forward. So now the first challenge, in my view, is not decarbonization. I think, again, this is based on Indian experience, before that Chinese experience, and what, as a scholar, I would think makes sense for African countries, which is development first. Now, you can still develop as greenly as possible, but development then means two things. One, planning for energy abundance. So I think most people have moved away or beyond this basic lifeline electricity access. You don't just want to charge a mobile phone or have lighting, but you want productive uses of energy, which then need more energy. Once you move up the ladder, it becomes clear that certain models of development, which were, for example, isolated microgrids, they work in niches, but they don't work everywhere equally, and they also become harder to electrify en masse, meaning give energy abundance. And so what India did just a decade ago was focus. First, they went to each village. They didn't connect each home, but they connected each village. That was done over a decade ago, a long time ago, much more than a decade ago. But then they said, now we want 100% household electrification. Now, what India has that Africa doesn't have is density. A lot of African nations are more sparse, so that raises the cost. So that then flags the second question, is it inherently going to be more expensive, this journey? To some extent it may, but it's also the fact that we want to use newer technologies. We want to perhaps leapfrog, but at the same time not have climate absolutism. That's another lesson from India and China, where they are adding renewables at remarkable rates. Renewables will grow in Africa, but they will not be your short-term answer 100%. Storage technologies are not yet cheap enough. So for those countries that have fossil fuels, a little bit should be allowed, not just allowed, but supported in a more flexible and green manner as possible. Fossil fuels will remain the backstop for some energy growth in the short term. And I think the numbers support the case, not just from a development perspective, but the emissions are so low out of many countries in sub-Saharan Africa. I'll end with one anecdote or statistic. All of sub-Saharan Africa, excluding South Africa, has just over 1% of global fossil CO2 emissions. Over 1 billion people. Almost the same amount is emitted by the sub 10 million people of UAE. That tells you the senses of scale and global disparity. Thank you.
Thanks, Rahul. There's a lot to follow up there, but Grace, would you like to come in now and either respond to Rahul or Kausi's remarks, or else just get us started on what are your opening thoughts?
Thanks, Vida. Good afternoon, everybody. I think I completely agree with what he just said. Firstly, the continent does need an increase in electricity access. We do have already, I think, about 600 million people that don't have access to electricity. That's like 40% of the continent. And like he said, it's not just being able to charge your phone. It's everything that we do now requires electricity. To have internet connectivity the whole day, you need electricity. And everything that we do is based on the internet. You can't function without email or even just WhatsApp. We mostly use WhatsApp to communicate. So it is very important for everybody to at least achieve that access to electricity one way or the other. And like Percy said, there is that Agenda 2063 looking at getting access to everybody on the continent, reliable, sustainable access. There are other initiatives on the continent with the African single electricity market targeting to interconnect the regions and the member states so that countries and power pools can trade electricity. There's a continental master plan that supports the vision of the African single electricity market through modeling activities, capacity building to the power pools and the member states. And then there's also the UN SDG 7 goals that are being tracked to ensure that everybody has access to clean, sustainable electricity. And then it comes, I think it takes me to, and then there's also PIDA, of course, which is very important on the continent, targeting the priority projects for the corridors interconnectivity. I want to get to the climate change. I think that's very important. Though we're not a very big contributor of energy emissions or carbon emissions, we have effects of climate change. We've seen the dry hydros due to the droughts that were unforeseen. A hydropower plant that was well performing suddenly cannot give the same capacity because of the droughts. We've seen damage to power plants or transmission lines due to storms, heavy storms and flooding. So I think what we need currently where we are is we need some form of climate resilience built into the existing infrastructure to sort of protect against the adverse impact of climate change, but also in the future generation plants that are coming and the infrastructure, we need to put in some form of climate smart technology to protect against that, whether we put floating PVs on the hydro plants or some other measure in place. And then also, I think just in terms of what we need in terms of the future generation expansion in Africa, it needs to be just taking into consideration the vulnerable communities. It needs to be inclusive. The youth and the women need to be included, taking into consideration that most of Africa's population is actually the youth. So it needs to include them, and the local communities need to be involved as well so that they can benefit. In terms of India's contribution, I think India's had a very great journey to achieving almost over 100% electricity access. So there's definitely lots of lessons learned that Africa can learn from, and also some form of capacity building because they've done it before. They know the best practices to follow. Instead of us learning the hard way, we can always benefit from people that have done it before. So I think I'll stop there for now. Thank you.
Thank you, Grace. Divyam, now from Kausi, Rahul, and Grace, we kind of get a sense of the problem that we're looking at and the scale of it. SE for All has done a lot of work fostering these partnerships to try and address some of this. So perhaps you can walk us through some of your initial thoughts.
Thanks, Veda, and yeah, thanks, Kosi, Rahul, and Grace for setting this up. Indeed, I think on the need side, it's pretty clear where, as you mentioned, I think the challenge exists. And just yesterday, the latest SDG7 tracking report came out, and what it tells us, even on the electricity access side, there were 565 million people in 2023 without access. That's only 5 million more than 2022. So the pace of growth is nearly not enough, right? Neither on the access side nor on the sort of generation side. So the gap exists. I think as SE for All, we work very closely with governments in Africa to support on the energy transition investment planning. So we've done those for Nigeria, Kenya, Ghana, Sierra Leone, Botswana, Tanzania are in the pipeline. So really working with governments to kind of understand over the next, let's say, 2 decades, 3 decades, how exactly do we optimally grow the energy sector and expand the energy sector, what the investment needs are. And then these plans are essentially coded into national legislation for investment mobilization, etc. I think the two sort of big pieces there are really on fully capturing the value proposition that renewables bring to the table. I think there is the cost side of the story in terms of, the levelized costs and the sort of, economic aspects of it. It's also about where that energy is best utilized and where it can go in the productive sectors, right? So a lot of economies where industries are still coming up, jobs have to be created. Most of them are commodity dependent, not much value added is happening. There is an open canvas in terms of understanding where a lot of that energy can be best utilized depending on what local resources exist, as Rahul mentioned, where each context is different. But also then how do we scale up energy access simultaneously with a mix of decentralized and centralized and what that mix looks like. So this requires a very heavy data sort of oriented kind of assessment, which is what we do, but it has to then be coded into national legislation so then we can mobilize the investments on the back of it. And I think that's where the crux of it really comes, right? I think we all can agree on all the things that are required and we need that speed and scale. But the bottom line is that even in India's case, if we look at the electrification experience, a lot of that was on the backing of very strong public financing deployment, right? Or institutions that can be able to do that. Now, where does that public financing come from? Where do we sort of mobilize the de-risking that India saw with its solar auctions or, on the rural electrification side? Does the international financing architecture or the development financing institutions, either at a continental level or an international level, are able to provide that level of backing for the countries to be able to deploy the infrastructure that is required to bridge the energy access deficit? So, on the one hand, there is a sort of major gap there. There's simply not enough financing going in and not enough public financing that is available, accessible to be able to drive that. We are working, a good example, just I think 2 days ago with the Nigerian Sovereign Investment Authority, the International Solar Alliance, Africa 50. We've just launched a $500 million DRE, Decentralized Renewable Energy Fund for Nigeria. So an example of a local sovereign investment authority coming together with international financing institutions to mobilize local currency to support the sector's deployment, whether it's power generation, mini grids, isolated grids, whatever it is that it will take to move the needle on access. So I think the big question really is on the plans are great, the need we understand, something is not working. And part of that is shown in the fact that we're not making progress on the investment mobilization, we're not making progress on the indicators that we're tracking. So what is it that we need to fix? And there, I think there's a strong role for South-South collaboration. I'm hoping that we can sort of unpack that a little bit more, including on, not just sort of deploying renewable technologies or any technologies on the continent, but also looking at how closely we can integrate those with industrialization, job creation objectives that countries have that Rahul also mentioned in terms of development first. Can we build local value chains? Can we leverage some of the mineral resources that countries have? How do we take a regional approach that Grace mentioned at a continental level, but also linking up with the rest of the global south? And how do we facilitate that flow of investments, technology, and skills? And I'm hoping we can get into a little bit of that as well.
Yeah, just to quickly follow up on that, Divyam, and perhaps Rahul, you could come in here as well, and Kosi, definitely you as well. and Grace, of course, you. This question of the high capital costs of investing in the continent, right? I was reading this report and it was saying the weighted average cost of capital in Africa is at like 15.5%, when it's at 2 and 5% for Western countries. So, but that just means that it's kind of a disincentive for all of the things that you mentioned, right? All of these investments into building value chains. How does one navigate that?
I think that's where the development financing institutions come into play, right? So the role of, if you look at infrastructure development traditionally, whether in the global north or even in China or India or parts of the global south, things have moved because of availability and access to long-term, affordable financing with, even some infrastructure getting grace periods with 30, 40-year tenors. Where is that kind of access? So that is coming through development financing to these countries anyways. Can we create systems to be able to, for the countries in Africa, which have infrastructure deficit, to be able to access that kind of financing? What role does the World Bank, African Development Bank, national development banks, Afri-Exim, and other stakeholders play? How does the de-risking instruments come into play from MEGA, from IFC, and other side? So there's on the project side, but then there's also the enterprise financing side. We work with a number of renewable energy manufacturers on the continent who still struggle to find even, let's say, $500,000, $1 million for project preparations, where we know, all of us know the large market that exists on the continent, but even the sort of early stages of project development for enterprises becomes challenging to access. So I think it's not something that's not been done. The playbook already exists. It's about sort of mobilizing the right kind of partners to be able to make those systems happen at a country level and a regional level.
Rahul, I'm going to come to you. Thanks, Divyam. But quickly, Kosi, what are the right kind of partners?
Yeah, thank you. For me, I think we need to refocus the rationale behind having access to energy. What I'm saying by that is that energy, rural electrification is important. Access to energy in the household is important. Above that, there's a development part of it, which is the industrialization part of it. That means that we are not just electrifying the community for the sake of doing that, because behind that, there's a development aspect that we need to through the industrialization, for instance, the transformative aspect of the produce that the rural community making. That kind of give a more reason why we should be able to invest into the energy electrification. For instance, the cost per kilowatt is now reduced to about below $2,000 per 1 kilowatt, which means that it's easy for most of the country in Africa to have a microgrid that will enable the rural community to be able to transform their produce into added value product that can be a market around their community in the country, and also looking into the regional market or cross-border market that will enable to the AFCTA to be able to generate more wealth. So that is a proposal that we are putting in place from my side to say, for Africa now, investing into energy is costly, but if you go to the micro route, like Rahul say, 10 years, 20 years back in India, then we have a winning process whereby we reduce the number of people who have no access to electricity. Second, we have it become transactional, whereby the investment or the involvement of the community is an integral part of the process. Government should not be looking at it in Africa as a means of winning vote, whereby then you electrify the community, then they are more inclined to vote for you for the next term that come for an election. No, it should be transactional in such a way that when we have rural electrification, it serves the purpose of transforming the community, empowering economically the community, and also ensuring that contribute to the whole region or at the national level and also regional level, so that it's more productive in such a way that we can see the value proposition in terms of why we are electrifying the community, why we are electrifying the rural area. And one aspect also is that the rural community are more responsible in terms of when you entrust them with a key issue like development, because they understand the the kinship, they understand the moral and the value that they have in terms of ensuring that the community survive, ensuring that community develop. Then if we take it from that perspective, we have a good player, the community that support whatever the governments are doing. Right now, you see government putting cable all around a certain part of the country and the region, but it doesn't sometimes serve the purpose of the community. We need to rethink the whole process to say, what are we electrifying? Is it because to tick the box that is part of the SDGs? Or we are electrifying or provide electricity because it to enable the community to develop, to be self-reliant in terms of what it needs to move from where they are and also contribute to the national GDP and the global development. I will stop here. Thank you.
Thank you, Kosi. Rahul.
I want to just make 3 points. Maybe they're slightly controversial. First, every time I hear the word de-risking, I sort of think that that's a bit of a misnomer, and it's often risk shifting. So Africa, like all countries, like India, has to be very cautious when the West says thou must de-risk. Obviously, people want lower risks, but some of them are inherent. Foreign exchange risk is something that's macroeconomic, does nothing to do with climate change or energy, and it has a cost of hedging because investors may want US dollar returns. So you have to be cautious when anyone says, I want to de-risk. Now, some risks can be improved. I'll come to that. But socialization is one solution for some of the risks, especially climate-related risks. Grace talked about hydropower plants that are changed weather patterns, for example. Things that are hard for any one investor to deal with should certainly be socialized, but we should come up with new instruments that share some of the risks globally. So how to lower costs of capital is absolutely important. The second point then is I want to also ping, it's not just cost of capital, but capital costs. Why is a project more expensive in parts of Africa? Same hardware, same many things. When India connected its Saubhagya scheme, they electrified the household level. So that started with a wire, a trunk line reaching each village. From there, they were incrementally connecting to households. That cost was only between $50 and $80 per house. It's not much at all. And when I looked at numbers from colleagues in Africa, the numbers are 5, 7, 10 times higher per household. Some of that is density, but some of that is something else. And that's the next step that countries have to figure out what's causing these differential. Is it logistics? Is it roads, ports, standards? Something that India did very well with standardization. Divyam, you talked about some of the tools for the portfolio, the toolkit. Corruption, I mean, that's the usual boogeyman, but I don't think that's the answer. There's always pockets of, let's not just say corruption, but distortions everywhere. So it's some of the distortions which are structural or regulatory, where incumbents are favored, where PSUs, public sector, are favored, where private sector is sometimes either crowded out or faces different sets of regulation. Those are another third area that I think countries can focus on to improve the growth of abundant energy. Lastly, in the same vein, when we talk about regulation, political economy is something India struggled with, and all countries developing, but even developed, struggle with. Electricity is both a commodity, but it's also a public good. It's viewed as two different sets of objectives you want out of it. So how do you handle it? I would suggest that Africa try and not treat paying customers, the commercial and industrial users, as cash cows. Don't overcharge them to make it affordable for the poor. That doesn't scale and it hurts your jobs story. So we need new models of how to finance, but also make things viable from a supplier perspective. You cannot have loss-making utilities and yet expect them to grow at the same time. So how do you cover costs? You can't pass all of them through. So one of the models that may work for Africa is we consider support, external in some cases, for capital costs. Operating costs should be paid by end users, so they don't treat electricity or energy like a cheap or subsidized good and then be wasteful about its use. So these are some of the things that are lessons from India and other developing countries that may be of relevance.
No, that's helpful, Rahul, and that is sort of helps us segue into the second part of the question, which is what kind of partnerships? Divyam, you spoke to this as well, South-South partnerships. Let's try and unpack that a little bit. We know a little bit, I mean, Rahul has spoken about the India story. We know some of the challenges, the problems that exist in several of these diverse African contexts. Where can we make meaningful partnerships? Prudence, welcome, and maybe we can get started with you.
Thank you so much. Good afternoon, good morning, everyone. Glad to be able to.
But we can't really hear you.
Are you able to hear me now?
No, I don't think we can hear you. Yes, better now.
Oh, okay. So good afternoon, everyone. Prudence Lihabi is my name. So just to pick up on the question that you've asked about the meaningful partnerships, I believe it's important for us to have both private and public partnerships so that we are able to realize all this. Just to give an example of what is happening in this space, like for the case of Kenya, there's a project that is currently happening that is now bringing in the members of parliament to really understand the issues of renewable energy and climate change and also aspects of financing. I think that is very important because as legislators, nobody will leave them behind. So that when you take projects to them, they really don't understand the nitty-gritties. When you're asking for the waivers, they really don't have a clue of why you're asking for incentives and waivers and things like that. So I think that's a very important partnership that we need to have with our legislators so that we bring them on board, though they're not technical experts. But that's a very key niche for us just to see how can we be able to unlock that. Because once they understand what we are talking about and why it's important, they'll really support the agenda and help us to raise funds both locally and also at a global scale. The second partnership that I'm thinking is very important is the community. As much as we are talking about these technologies, they are wonderful, yes, they're transformational, but if we don't start with the community first, there will be stranded assets in the different villages that will be going in. So communities should be at the forefront in terms of even as we are starting all the way from design. What do they think about the projects that you want to bring them in? How do they feel in terms of how you are addressing the issues that is happening in their community and also their dignity and preservation of their culture. So I think community is also one partnership that we really need to unlock, and just going through the community leaders who are like the voices of the community and making them champions of the projects that we want to do, that will really help us unlock a lot in terms of just moving forward. And then over and above the private sector, who are also very keen, just trying to look at some of the innovations that they are having and all that. And then also the other partnership that I think is very important is the financial institution, especially the local bank. A case example is for Kenya. You'll have like a local bank has an array of loan products, but you find nothing is going to renewable energy because they really don't understand the nitty-gritties of financing a renewable energy project or a clean cooking project. In that case, they see it as a risk. And it's just because they really don't understand what is happening in that space. So I think it's an opportunity for us also to unlock that so that now they start adopting some of the loan products that they have to really support the local innovations that are happening. Because if you look at the scale, you'll find some are very small scale. So you cannot go to the likes of the World Bank and the African Development Bank. So it's very important for us to unlock that and just bring them on board so that they really understand what we are talking about when we are talking about energy access and the technologies that are there. Thank you so much. Back to you, Vida.
Thank you, Prudence. You kind of summed up the three big things that we were actually talking about before you joined us.
Okay.
And I just want to quickly tell our audience that please feel free to raise your hands and come in and ask questions to the panel. I see a lot of friends in the audience. Kudak from PowerShift Africa, I'm looking at you specifically. But while they gather their thoughts, Divyam, can you give us some real world examples of where this has actually worked? Because I think we're still kind of talking about things in the realm of possibility. Could you sort of ground this for us?
Sure. So maybe just some examples of, how we've seen some of these partnerships play out, particularly South-South and also linking between India, Africa. So on the policy front, as Rahul mentioned, there's of course, a wealth of policy experience on both sides, but particularly in India, not just on sort of deploying some of the energy solutions, structuring some of those projects and auctions and policies, but also understanding what lessons have been learned, for instance. So we've particularly between India and Nigeria, last year we brought in an entire delegation from Nigeria, from the Ministry of Transport, Ministry of Energy, particularly on electric buses and understanding how India went about the procurement process with the ESL, with the Ministry of Heavy Industries on the value chains, the production-linked incentives, and the entire ecosystem with its standards, charging infrastructure, etc. We are doing exactly the same also with Kenyan colleagues, not just on e-mobility, but also on energy efficiency towards the latter part of the year. And there's a strong interest in terms of understanding, how India went about different runs of the energy transition on the power sector side, solar parks, but also some of the other aspects. On skilling as well, we've seen a lot of appetite for partnerships development. Again, Kenya as an example where Indian training institutions have, we facilitated some of those exchanges with universities in Kenya to bring curriculum, adapt the curriculums, and support sort of nascent industries on the e-mobility side, but also on the energy sector side, on batteries, to build curriculums and build capacities to be able to support the sector there. I think an interesting area is also around technology, R&D, but also on sort of trade minerals. Kosi mentioned the Africa Green Mineral Strategy. A key pillar of that is around downstreaming and developing local value chains for manufacturing and assembly of two-wheelers, solar modules, batteries. Again, an area where India has done a lot over the past few years and built almost an entirely vertically integrated sector. Again, we're facilitating a lot of exchanges there. Just last week, we had an India-Africa Solar Manufacturers Roundtable, again, facilitating that exchange between industry in terms of what kind of partnerships could come out of that. Finally, I do want to mention one big piece is on the sort of political diplomacy side, or elevating the voices of the global South, where I think that partnership really has a strong role to play. With the G20, India's presidency, the AU coming in, and now the South Africa taking over the G20 presidency, we are working to support them in the development of a negotiated outcome of developing green industrialization hubs in the global South. And there again, we see a very strong area of work and opportunity to institutionalize the South-South collaboration to support countries, as Kosi mentioned, on identifying those industrialization opportunities, how those sectors can develop, and how we can sort of integrate energy transition and energy access into those objectives, particularly around mining, around cement, aluminium, but also new industries that are coming to fore. So a lot of different pieces and a lot of concrete opportunities for collaboration, but already a lot in motion that we can build on.
Thanks, Divyam. Did anyone else want to come in on ideas on what form these partnerships could take, or even real-world examples from your own regions, countries where collaborations, not just with India, with other countries, have worked positively?
Maybe I can come in again just to share the case, the case of Kenya, whereby we are seeing development partners really working together with the Ministry of Energy, and also the private sector and the other civil society organizations. I think this has really been a great path in terms of just advancing the agenda of making sure everyone has access to clean energy. And I'll give an example of what JZ Kenya has been doing for over a long time in Kenya, where now they decided to really support the agenda of the ministry. So through that, we have seen a lot happening. We have seen them supporting the strategies for the Ministry of Energy. We've seen them even doing capacity building of the Ministry of Energy, just bringing together the private sector and also some of the civil society, so that now we are able to champion that. So I think for Kenya, a lot has gone around just in terms of bringing the financial institutions together, the non-governmental organizations, bringing in the government and also some of the development partners. And I think that has really helped us in terms of just making sure we are driving the agenda to make sure everyone has access to clean energy.
Thanks. Grace, did you want to weigh in quickly? I also quickly want to remind our attendees to please raise your hand or come in with any of your questions. Grace.
Thanks, Vida. Yes, I just wanted to add, I think in terms of financing, I think it will need a bit of innovative solutions to financing. I think we need to sort of try something different so that we can actually start getting more access on the ground in the smaller communities, perhaps. So maybe whether it's the public sector, the private sector, or people in the community actually taking the initiative. I know people that do have access to money, then they go and install their own solar home solutions, but not everybody can afford that. And the battery that is required to have full-time access the whole day. And then the other thing I wanted to add in terms of partnerships as well, the skills to the local people, skills development, whether it's assembling some of the infrastructure that's needed instead of importing completed goods, maybe they can be taught how to assemble those or manufacture them locally or repair them. And that will sort of drive that green industrialization that's coming in at the moment. So I just wanted to add those two things. I think everybody else has said everything else. Thank you.
No, thank you. We do have a question from Partha Mukhopadhyay. Partha, would you like to ask the question?
You're muted, Partha.
Partha, your video and audio is off. Would you like to switch them on and ask the question?
He's saying he's in a noisy place, so I think we can respond. Sorry, whether you're muted as well.
Thank you. What kind of experience sharing is happening within Africa in the sector? Are there networking organizations with which Indian organizations can work, or does it have to be with individual countries like Divyam was talking about? Divyam, do you want to quickly weigh in?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think what is, and I'd love for the other colleagues to chime in as well, we are seeing sort of thematic forums emerge where that knowledge sharing is already happening. So for instance, that the work that we're doing on green industrialization and value chains, there are a number of forums that, for example, SE for All itself has created or the AU has created, which convene and through which we can sort of transfer some of this, we do some of these knowledge exchanges. We use forums like Mining Indaba, others to be able to host some of these knowledge exchange forums. But then, for example, when we have to affect change at a national level on the implementation side, that's where some of the bilateral engagements that I mentioned sort of come into play. But just to say that there are thematic forums, depending on the topic that we are trying to deal with, that come into play when you look at experience sharing.
Yes, Kudak.
Hi everyone. I think you can hear my audio without my video. I think that's okay. Yeah, thanks Vida for pointing me out. I wasn't ready to speak, but I do have some points to share. Especially I think I was very inspired by Grace's comment around the PIDA and the Africa Continental Plan. And the reason being, I think based on what the presenters have been speaking about, Africa is lagging behind a lot in terms of the infrastructure, the basic infrastructure. So there's a potential for outsized impact if we invest in the right interconnectors and the right backbone infrastructure, as I call it. My worry is, and I think this links to Raul's point around the de-risking of finance, etc. programs that are coming on board in Africa. There's a lot of last mile financing that's coming from private investment, which does not actually focus on creating or improving the backbone of the energy infrastructure on the continent. So, for example, what comes to mind is Mission 300, which which is being led by the AFDB and the World Bank. In itself is a great program trying to drive 300 million people out of energy poverty. But the mechanism is very much based on ensuring that there's a return on investment. And I feel like that's very difficult when you're trying to focus on actually developing the backbone of the infrastructure on the continent. So I think there's a need to reevaluate how some of the projects that are actually getting financing actually end up being implemented. The danger being we end up maybe in 5 years, an argument being said that mini grids do not work on the continent, which becomes dangerous because they do work. But if they came based on a private sector-led development model, asking for, let's say, twice as much returns, and they want the returns within 3 to 5 years from a rural community that only earns $1.25, we are basically putting the blame on the wrong thing, right? So I think there's a need for a big focus on investing in the right aspects of our infrastructure, first of all, but more importantly, ensuring that it's public financing. And then lastly, I just want to give a good example to put this point out. Recently, Zambia and Tanzania started working on the interconnector between the two countries. Funny enough, 2 years ago, Zambia was going through a drought. Zambia and Zimbabwe were going through a severe drought. Tanzania had a lot of hydro, but they had to literally let go of the energy potential without sharing it with Zambia and Zimbabwe because there was no interconnector. So these are some of the tangible benefits that are there. In a lot of cases, it's not that there's not enough power going around the continent. This is not to say we have enough energy. That's not the point. But the point is there's a base for us to work from, but we have to invest in the right nodes for us to actually get the right development we need. And I think I'll stop there. Thanks.
Thanks, Kodak. Rahul, did you want to respond to that?
Well, thank you. Well, not really respond, but agree with Kodak's points. Two of them I want to pick up on. One was, of course, when the example was made that someone wants to make all their money in a couple of years. Infrastructure is, in theory, meant to last a long time. Now, in the name of risk, which is sometimes inflated, perceptions, people are having expectations and price points that are unnecessarily high. And what this leads to is this dichotomy where India also has faced it. You have high costs, ergo low volume, and they're chicken and egg. You want to get to the other side of the valley. You want to cross the chasm to move to a low-cost, high-volume regime. Those are also an equilibrium that's sustainable, but getting there is the real problem. And I think one of the ways to handle that is another phrase that Kodak mentioned, which is that chain. Different components of the energy system have different levels of risk, different levels of cost, and we really want to focus on, similar to what India did, where it said, look, we'll get to the households later, but let's get the trunk lines put in. So we get inter-country trunk lines, we get cross-country trunk lines, from which medium voltage, low voltage then becomes easier. Instead, if you do a more ad hoc approach, you said, oh, look, here's a willing to pay buyer or an industry or a whatever. They need energy, so we'll do something for them. And then it turns out that doesn't help the neighborhood or the overall economies of scale because it's tailored to a niche or to a smaller finite load. Instead, we have to plan ahead for 5-10 years that, look, that demand will come, people will pay, but there'll be a little bit of upfront investment that's worth biting the bullet. And that's really where global funds can come in, which is that patient money that can last infrastructure timescales instead of higher. In a past life, I worked on telecom in Africa a little bit. And we saw that again. Countries that had the biggest leap towards internet connectivity spent some amount of thought on how to get backbone global interconnections, whether it was especially fiber interconnections as opposed to satellite interconnections, because they're not comparable in terms of the scale that they can provide. That same analogy holds true, I think, for the power sector in Africa.
Divyam?
I just want to add that I think it's not an either or, right? I think you basically need all engines firing. So, but as part of a coordinated strategy, Rahul mentioned. But because when we do the planning at the country level, a lot of the sort of the industrialization hubs or the consumption hubs are not there yet, right? So in a lot of cases, for example, mining sometimes accounts for the largest share of your power generation, which is mostly captive. So you try to build around that, etc. But I think when we look at sort of power pools and interconnection, they're a key part of the pillar, yes. So those need to be funded, the plans are there, those interconnections need to be funded, and they play a key role on resilience and making sure there's trade happening. At the sort of Mission 300, of course, addresses sort of the more decentralized nature of, renewable energy solutions. And there, of course, we can say, okay, one form of delivery model is different from the other form of delivery model. But at the end of the day, there are certain things that have to be in place to push these solutions along. And we know what those are. Like if I have to deploy a solar PV IPP, I know the structure of a power purchase agreement, the kind of investments that are needed, the transmission infrastructure needed, what kind of investment needs to come in. All of those things are well understood. The point is on making those happen, putting in place the capacities, implementing them, and then most importantly, mobilizing the financing. And I think that's where the big issue is coming in.
Right. I think that's come up a lot in the last hour, actually. Kosi, did you want to come in?
Yes, and thank you. I think from my perspective, I think we need to take step a little back to say what a given country wants to see in terms of development. What is within the National Development Plan in terms of energy? And we all agree that the infrastructure cost for energy is very high, and is for most of countries deterrent because they don't want to just put a line and not be able to pay because we all agree that the cost of the capital cost is high. Then my approach will be to say, okay, for a growing country in terms of economy, what do they need to be able to ensure that when they have the energy, they will be able to afford it and pay? Because the resources, the finances coming from outside the country. Therefore, it would be good to look into that to say, as a given country, we need to grow our industries. We need to grow our, have a higher productivity capacity to be able to say, when we produce more, then we are able to pay because we have the resources to pay, because we are not just generating energy that doesn't have any return, because every action or transaction that has to have a return. And we need to move away from donor-related or partnership whereby we hope that a country A will fund a country B energy demand in Africa. It won't happen. So we need to come and look at the National Development Plan to say, for each country, what is required. Then it would be important to say that it's not a solution that fits all, but a specific country with the requirement with a development growth lens to say, for us to be able to pay, then we need to be able to do A, B, C, D. And we need to grow our base of industries. We need to produce more a given good from a given sector within the country. So we need to be able to identify those areas and to be able to say, as a country, in a sovereign country, how are you able to source your energy? How are you able to pay for it? What will drive your economy to be able to sustain the payment? So these are critical discussions that we need to have to assess each country to be able to say, country A, country B, country C is able to do as much they can based on the resources that they have. I'm not going to go to the extractive part because that is drain the energy. But what is beyond that we can do that grow the economy? Because then we're talking about, when you talk about mineral in Africa, you talk about monolithic economy that focus on the extractive. But beyond that, there are other avenues for generating wealth, generating and growing the economy that they need to look into, and then focus that and or reframe that in their national development plan and be able to pay for it. Each sovereign country should be able to pay for its debt. Those debt are important because that define the cost of capital and the cost of the interest rate. That's why India can have low interest rate versus any country in Africa, because they have the capability to pay. So there are other factors, of course, in terms of the low interest rate. But we need to be very careful when we talk about access of electricity, access of energy, production, interconnectivity, and all that. So we need to be very careful. Thank you.
Thank you. I see Prudence and Rahul, both of you have your hands up. Is it super urgent interventions, or can I club your interventions or two of the questions that we have in the Q&A box? Is that too much?
Go for it.
Quickly, because we are running out of time. So I quickly want to, I will come to you, but Partha has a question on human resources. As networks expand, one needs skilled technicians at locations where they have not historically been present, especially for renewable energy. Is that a constraint in African countries, especially with regard to maintenance? Kodak has a question completely different section. What is the potential of the growing BRICS membership as a pathway for greater India-Africa relations? So if you could club these two in your responses. Rahul, do you want to go first and then Prudence?
Sure. Just two, three quickly. So Partha, I think absolutely human capacity is a bottleneck. It's a global bottleneck because what we're asking our power and energy systems to do in the future is very different than the old grid. The old grid was more predictable. The old grid was more centralized. Now you're looking at a future that's a lot more dynamic, nimble, and uncertain. So human capacity is a worldwide challenge, but more so in developing regions because some of these are high tech. So absolutely. Now, does that translate into costs? To some extent. But I want to just counter with an anecdote. Every time I hear people say, oh, it's too expensive. So there's that famous phrase, if you think education is expensive, try ignorance. Well, if you think energy is expensive, try darkness. So a lot of countries in Africa are paying for diesel generator as backups. They're paying or in the dark. It would be good to have studies that have been done in India that quantify loss to GDP or productivity or competitiveness due to either unavailability of energy or bad quality energy. So even if you have the grid, it's not reliable. So you either have diesel or you underutilize your industrial or commercial processes because the quality of power isn't there. So I think that's another lens that, yes, costs should be affordable, but they're not the only bottleneck. And Partha's question really emphasizes what else is out there. Human capacity is one side. BRICS Plus, I'm not an expert. I mean, now BRICS is called BRICS Plus, since it's not just the BRICS countries. It's not clear because BRICS has its own pathways, its own dynamics. I think India especially is building multilateral or plurilateral relationships within Africa. They may continue, but I'm not a foreign policy expert to speak on that. Veda, you would know more about foreign policy. Maybe it would be nice to hear your thoughts on that question as well.
I will, but today I have my moderator hat on, Rahul, and we're approaching the end. So, Kurak, we can talk about it separately. Prudence, quickly, your thoughts.
Yeah, just to quickly add to what Tosi was saying in terms of being very intentional with the planning, I think that's very important, especially when you're doing the planning, just to start at a community level to understand what energy needs they have as a community, and then scale it up now to a national level. Because what we normally do, we do a national plan and then we try to scale it down, which is now supposed to be the other way around, whereby we are starting with the communities and then scale it up so that we don't have a mismatch, because we might end up having energy that is unutilized. So it will be good for us to start from our community level and just see what works for them. Is it the grid? Is it the mini grid? Is it the DREs? So that now it's very clear, and then now we have a national plan. And then just to respond to the green skills inhibiting us to transition, I think that it's also, it has been an inhibitor in some areas, because you might find, and like for the new technologies, like for wind technology, nuclear, and all that are just coming to Africa, we really don't have the skill set. So we have to go outside to import the labor. And you might find in some communities, they may not take it well. So they will fight the project, not because it's a bad project, but just because they see foreigners are the ones working there. And it's very hard for you to explain to someone that you need a required set of expertise for you to do this. So the only jobs we can give you are in this cadre and below. So you find they're fighting that project, which might not prosper just because of the lack of skills. So I think it's very important just for us to look at some of these skills and try to also to match them with what the market is looking at. Because looking at, I don't know if it's the case for other African countries, but just an example of Kenya, you'll find that we have a skill mismatch. You'll find an engineer has been trained in electrical, mechanical, and all that. But in the energy space that is changing every day, new technologies are coming in. we are seeing limited trainings that are going to help us to upskill and reskill, and even just internship opportunities that will allow us to go and really look into that space and grow our expertise. So I think lack of skills has a huge impact in terms of our transition. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you, Prudence. So as we come to the end, we've actually at time now. If I had to do a rapid fire to close, right? And the wonderful thing about teaming up with COSI's Agency-NEPAD is that they have access to every single African member state. And this, whatever you say today, is in some shape or form going to reach some policy document, which we hope to forward to them. So if you could all take a quick minute to sort of highlight, among all of the things that we spoke today, what do you think is most urgent in terms of a policy initiative, an instrumental mechanism that can sort of push this agenda of energy abundance? In terms of an advice or policy priority, what would that area be? Grace, I want to start with you because you've been super quiet.
Thanks, Vida. So I think in terms of the policy, it would definitely be, I think we've covered it, it needs to be inclusive. It needs to include the local personnel, it needs to be just, it needs to be green. So I think, but important to serve, uplift the community that's going to use the electricity, because in so doing, you're also creating new jobs. You're upskilling them and creating new jobs, giving them sustainability. So I think I'll stop there. Thanks, Vida.
Thank you, Grace. Divyam?
I think from my side, if one intervention, if we are able to institutionalize this South-South collaboration in one way or the other, because the demand is there on the policy side, investment side, technology side, skill side, everything that we've talked about today. But there's no institutional mechanism at this point to be able to structure this sort of demand generation and facilitate this and take this forward in a structured way to its conclusion. I think that's would really be a value added in the space. It's something we are trying with the mineral side, with the Council of Critical Minerals Development in the Global South. But I think that would be a real value add, especially with stakeholders on this call.
No, absolutely. I've been following some of the council's work and it's just brilliant. Prudence?
For me, I think just to add up to what Grace has said, I think as we are looking at increasing access to energy, Africa needs to write its own story. It's very important for us to create our own transition journey and what that looks like, so that now we are able to speak to some of the unique needs that we have in terms of the geographical location and also our culture and just what is happening in Africa. I think it will be very important for Africa not to copy and paste, but just come up with our own roadmap that will speak to them, embracing and appreciating the differences and the diversity that we have. Thank you.
So important. Thank you, Prudence. Rahul, almost last word.
I think what I would ask for is mechanisms and finance, building on what Prudence said, for human capacity to do their internal homework. This has to be bottom up. There has to be a better ask. It's not just more as more money or more technology, but better. So countries shouldn't just be responding to external pressures, external demand, or external expectations. That effort is where many countries need to focus. Climate absolutism I talked about is just one risk. Subnational inequity is another. It's not only that you have inequity across countries, you have strong subnational inequity, urban areas versus rural, etc. And so that effort and that level of granularity is a homework that only the countries can do or should be doing.
Wonderful. What a way to end. COSI, if I may give you the closing remarks, quickly, you can help us close.
Yeah, thank you. First of all, I want to thank the panelists for opening up and discussing the real issue and putting the real issues on the table. And with that, in a reservation, and also from the India side, our colleague, the experience of India, and also coupled with the experience in Africa, I believe that this has created a new path, a new thinking in terms of how do we tackle this issue of challenge of development. Energy is a developmental issue, and how do we tackle in Africa? And also, it's my hope that we'll continue the discussion beyond this panel meeting and also this webinar, and to be able to create a consensus around how do we collaborate, sub collaboration play in terms of supporting the development of Africa, specifically within the energy sector. Thank you.
Thank you, Kosi. I really want to end on that thought. This is just the beginning. Hopefully, we've lit a spark somewhere and we can find ways to collaborate and work together. So thank you all of you panelists for joining us today. And thanks to all the participants who are here. Have a wonderful rest of the day. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Bye.
Thanks.
Thank you. Bye.